All right. Well, looking at this portrait, we see the King of France, who is gracefully showing off his legs here. Louis was a dancer, and he took great pride in having toned legs. We see him in his full coronation robes. Note the use of the royal blue color and those little golden flowers. That's the fleur de lis, which is the royal symbol of France. He has a sword. He's holding a scepter. He's looking pretty pleased with himself here. And Louis said that of his rule, of his absolute rule of France, he said, L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. For Louis, for the King of France, there was no difference between him and the concept of the French state. And I think that idea is expressed in this portrait. He has surrounded himself with these symbols of power, with the symbols of the state. And in fact, this painting acted as a replacement for Louis. It hung over his throne. And even if Louis wasn't seated on his throne, attendants could not turn their backs to the painting, just as they would not turn their backs to the king himself. That is pretty powerful. Now, Louis, with the very healthy ego that he had, he also decided he needed a new place to live outside of Paris so he could express his authority, and a new kind of a mini city in Versailles, where he would make all of his advisors, all of the other aristocrats move. And he did this so that he could keep better tabs on everybody. He liked to have complete control over everything. And this is the Palace of Versailles that has hundreds of rooms, dozens of staircases, and the Hall of Mirrors, I think, is one of the clearest expressions of what is called an absolute monarchy. And Louis is the prime example of that. No expense was spared. We see crystal chandeliers. Mirrored glass at this time was very expensive, and we see a whole wall of mirrors. Gilded candlesticks, parquet flooring, marble inlay, paintings on the ceilings. This is absolute monarchy at its furthest extent. And I want to bring in a kind of very recent take on a new interpretation on this kind of expression of European absolute monarchy. The contemporary Black American artist Kehinde Wiley takes these old portraits, these kind of pompous portraits of Louis, or here we see a portrait of Napoleon on his imperial throne, and he puts pop figures like Ice-T, or just everyday people in the same position. And he translates these images of historical authority into a contemporary version that kind of resonates with fury and anger. I think that there is, switching the figure from a white European megalomaniac to a Black American pop culture icon, it creates here a dialogue about race and power as well. Who has historically been marginalized? Which groups of people have been left out of these images of power? And I think that, substituting a Black figure, it really confronts and critiques these historical traditions that don't even acknowledge the Black cultural experience. And I think it also makes a bigger statement about portraiture. This is Kehinde Wiley's own quote about what portraiture does. He says, "What is portraiture? It's choice. It's the ability to position your body in the world for the world to celebrate you on your own terms. And he says specifically about including Black men in portraiture. He says, painting is about the world we live in. Black men live in the world. My choice is to include them. This is my way of saying yes to us. Really powerful. And if you think, well, I've maybe seen this name before, it is because Kehinde Wiley was commissioned to do the official portrait of President Barack Obama that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., alongside the official portraits of all other presidents. And to choose a young, mid-career Black American painter to complete his official portrait, I think is a statement also of inclusion and acknowledging Black cultural achievement in the United States. Let's stick to presidents here, and we're going back to George Washington. This portrait of George Washington, I think, is kind of what we often, this is how we see George Washington, right? This kind of neoclassical version of him. It almost looks like it's an ancient Greek sculpture. It's all white marble, very, the kind of typical frontal stance, the freestanding sculpture here. In fact, this style is called neoclassicism because it uses so many elements of ancient Greek sculpture. And this portrait of Washington stands still in the Virginia State House today. It was the Virginia State Legislature that voted to commission this portrait of Washington to commemorate his wartime service in the Revolutionary War. And they choose a French artist, Jean-Antoine Houdon, to complete this work. And Houdon traveled to the United States, to Mount Vernon, to take Washington's measurements and make a mold of his face. So this is a very naturalistic portrait. And then he decides, instead of maybe putting Washington in a Greek toga, making it more classical, more Greek, he decides to keep Washington in modern dress. Now, this is not the only vision of Washington that we see. We are used to seeing Washington in modern dress, but that was a pretty risky decision in the late 18th century. More conventional would have been to depict him in a classical toga, such as the one we see here in Horatio Greenough's George Washington from the 1830s. Now, this portrait seems pretty shocking to us today. This is not how we often see Washington depicted, with his chiseled abs and arms. He's seated here as if he is a Greek god. This is George Washington as Zeus, pointing up to the sky with this kind of stern expression, the Greek toga. This is so idealized, so Greek, so classical that it's kind of jarring to us today. And in fact, this is just not the version of George Washington portrait that became the most popular. And this is shown in the Smithsonian, but I believe it's on display there today, but it was just in the basement of the Smithsonian for a long time because they didn't know what to do with it. All right, when we come back, we're going to return to Picasso and see how Picasso uses his highly abstract modern art of Cubism to critique political power in the 1930s.